I just saw it just before I left. 8% of the population has COVID.
What's that?
8% of Phoenix has COVID.
I'm not surprised. Now he's fellow American, but not much.
That's for sure.
And the living proof is just in the election.
Yeah.
48% still think he's great.
Yeah. This weekend's going to be interesting.
What's that?
This weekend's going to be interesting. I guess there's all kinds of marches or truckers for Trump and all that. I'm waiting until we either concede or we vote or see what violence is.
That's probably won't be till the end of December.
Yeah. I know Jeff lives in the Tampa area. He says it's crazy. So hardcore.
Yeah. Talking to some of them down there when we were in Texas last year, I said, you guys have a history of taking care of these things very quickly. Under $1.
Yeah.
I said, how come it hasn't happened? He said, nobody wants to create a martyr. And then the other thing was, the people who would do that are all their supporters.
Yeah, that's right. I guess even,
but I'm sure if it carries on.
Even some of the election, well, they just said, guy who's in charge of the election for Philadelphia.
Yeah, he saw that.
He's had threats against him, and that was the Republican.
And he hasn't told any
They won't.
Well, we don't have to recount Pennsylvania. They're up to 7%.
Yeah,
but he has to see
0.7%.
Yeah, he can demand it if he wants, but then he has to pay for it.
0.5.
Yeah.
Anything up to 0.5.
Arizona's only 0.1.
What's that?
Arizona's 0.1. But if he wants to recount, he can have it, but he pays for it. I don't think the guy's doing better than wanted to.
Unless he uses some of his Putin money.
Well, yeah, that too. That's for sure. Yeah, most of this would be just jammed, do they? Shut down the LRT and a whole bit.
They were telling people on the news last night not to come down to watch the churches.
Dog walkers are out.
What's that?
All the dog walkers are out.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mom's house sold within a week.
Yeah. It's amazing.
Crazy. Yeah.
And then you go up to Paula's place, she couldn't barely give it away.
Really?
But that's Thunder Bay.
We're on the regional water right now. So the Toronto people down here buying a house for half a place.
That's their boy. That's the area. And Purple Boy.
Yeah.
Purple is Canada.
Yeah, so the church has a, I don't know if they've got a full floor here, they say they got, that was part of the deal in the whole process. Right now they're up the street here.
Yeah.
Diana Lynn was going to be the girl.
This day, as we gather, we take note of the fact that prior to the ceremony, a number of wreaths have been presented with the greatest honor and respect to our fallen heroes and those who have served. Kitchener Firefighters Association, Veterans Affairs Canada, in memory of Gunner Mike L. Bradbury, in memory of Albert Russell and all POW Hong Kong veterans. 98.5 CKWR Wheel Community Radio. Army, Navy, and Air Force Veterans Unit number 247. Canadian Corps of Commissioners Hamilton. Correctional Service of Canada, the Grand Valley Institution for Women. QP Local 68, City of Kitchener Outside Workers. Herb and Herb Insurance Brokers Limited. Herb and Good Family Funeral Home. German-Canadian Remembrance Society. The Grand River Masonic Lodge, number 151. Kitchener Wilmot Hydro Incorporated. Knights of Columbus, Father Funkin Council, number 1504. Memory Gardens Funeral Home and Cemetery. Royal Canadian Legion Zone C2. Royal Canadian Legion Elmira Branch, 469. Royal Canadian Legion Waterloo Branch, 530. Royal Canadian Air Force Association, number 404, KW Wing. St. John Ambulance. SMWIA Local 562. Stantec. UCCO Grand Valley Institution. Waterloo Catholic District School Board. Waterloo Wellington Dufferin and Gray Building and Construction Trades Council. As per our tradition, we pause this day to hear the names of those who left this community for the front lines of service. And we remember those who paid the supreme sacrifice. Petty Officer Norman Amstein, Major F.S. Allen, Sergeant Pilot Gordon Anderson, Flying Officer Robert Anderson, Private Albert Atkinson, Corporal Walter Atwood, Merchant Marine Earl Bach, Sergeant Ralph Battler, Private Thomas Bard, Corporal Philip Barley, Flight Sergeant Howard Baudouin, Captain John Becker, Lieutenant Henry Belanger, Private James Bell, Private H. Bendig, Flight Sergeant Claude Berges, Captain Neil Byer, Gerald Black, Flying Officer Dalton Block, Private James Bonner, Sergeant Gerald Beaupre, Sergeant Edward Bowman, Sergeant Keith Boyer, Lance Corporal George Bardshaw, Flight Sergeant Alan Braniff, Sergeant Fred Resnick. Petty Officer James Brown. Flying Officer Marvin Brown. Private Eldon Brooks. Flying Officer Donald Brubaker. Private William Buck. Lieutenant William Bedell. Corporal N. Button. Private D.R. Burkholder. Private James Burns. Captain Oscar Christensen. Trooper Gerald Class. Private Eugene Clutterbuck. Private Kenneth Cochran. Alan Collicott. Corporal George Collins. Sergeant Pilot Stanley Connor. George Corbry. Private Ambrose Kulas. Captain David Cowan. Private Thomas Crawford. Corporal Carl Culligan. W.C. Davies. Sergeant Edward Dingley. Sergeant Hubert Dittmer. Flight Sergeant Norman Doan. Gerald Dorsch. Sergeant Pilot Hugo Dotzenroth. Private George Drummond. Sergeant Floyd Dench. Lloyd Dufton. Ambrose Dwyer. Sergeant Benjamin Eichler. Lance Corporal E.L. Eismaner. George Elliott. Petty Officer Walter Engelert. Petty Officer Jack Ernst. A.B. John Evans. Sub-Lieutenant Paul Fahrenholtz. Private Arnold Farrell. Private Oscar Fisher. Lance Corporal Kenneth Freed. Private Raymond Frizzell. Private Carl Fugia. Private Peter Gallowich. Private Francis Gale. Sergeant Major Alex Gibson. Sergeant Lloyd Glasser. Private Ralph Graham. Lieutenant Henry Gross. Flying Officer David Grundy. Sergeant Alfred Hackbart. Private William Hagan. Lieutenant Grant Hall. Private Harold Haller. Private W. Harden. Charles Harris. Warrant Officer Walter Harris. Warrant Officer George Hartog. Private Elmer Hartog. Lieutenant John Harvey. Private Earl Haas. Flying Officer Alan Hayes. Flight Sergeant Russell Hayes. Lieutenant Robert Hurd. Private Robert Heer. Private John Heimbuck. Sergeant Pilot John Heinrich. Lance Corporal John Herget. Petty Officer Gerald Herget. Private David Hertzberger. Private Robert Hickson. Private Fred Hilker. Sergeant Pilot Ralph Hill. Private Harold Hillis. Private George Hawk. Flying Officer Robert Hondrick. Flying Officer Woodrow Hostetler. Flying Officer George Hubble, Corporal Alan Hind, Flight Sergeant Alan Eamson, Private John Irvin, Private William Irvin, Private Carl Janowski, Flying Officer Wallace Jardine, Lieutenant J. Norbert Jeffers, Private Hubert Jennings, Petty Officer Donald Jones, Private Joseph Anthony Jordan, Private Harold Cadflesh, Private John Kaplan, Warrant Officer William Kaufman, Kenneth Kelly, Major Douglas Kennedy, Major Peter Kennedy, Private Fred Kesselring, Lieutenant Alfred Kingsley, Corporal Wilson Necton, Sergeant Louis Herkel, Lieutenant Alan Cool, Flying Officer William Kuntz, Private Donald Leash, Private William Lees, Corporal Lyle Leslie, Flying Officer Lincoln Thomas, Sergeant Robert Lintick, Flying Officer Jack Lippert, Sergeant R.M. Livak, Petty Officer Roy Loesch, Sergeant Pilot Douglas Lowe, Gunner Roy Ludwig, Warrant Officer Dennis Lorenz, Flight Sergeant A.R. McDonald, Petty Officer John McDonald, Private William McPherson, Flying Officer Donald McIntosh, Lieutenant William Martin, Private Al Mason, Private Joseph Mazeritz, Private Harvey McCaffrey, Observer Sam McMahon, Private John McFarland, Warrant Officer Charles McIntosh, Flying Officer Donald McKay, Sergeant Donald Metz, Private Art Mayer, Private Victory Mayer, Private Wilfred Miller, Lieutenant James Milner, Lance Corporal Douglas Molman, Private Robert Molman, Leonard Moser, Private Arthur Mueller, Petty Officer John Musser, Sergeant Alex Niesny, Private Harold Oakley, Kenneth McGrath, Flying Officer Willard Page, Flying Officer Franklin Page, Private Joseph Hittner, Captain Carl Holzen, Private George Potter, Private Edward Prokop, Private Edgar Quast, Private Carl Ratke, Sergeant Robert Ron, Trooper Albert Lohr, Lance Corporal W.J.M.M. Ray, Flying Officer Walter Rakoff, Corporal William Ryber, Private Lawrence Reidner, Sergeant John G.C. Rennie, Warrant Officer Robert Richardson, Petty Officer Harry Rickard, Private Leslie Roberts, Lieutenant J.P. Robinson, Private Harold Rochelequin, Corporal John Komanoff, Private Samuel Roseman, Samuel Roselle, Oscar Rump, Earl Rappel, Carl Sass, Leonard Schell, Sergeant Kenneth Schlegel, Private Howard Schluter, Private E.J. Schmidt, Petty Officer Ken Schmidt, Private Alex Scholas, Roy Schnarr, Petty Officer Barry Shoemaker, Lieutenant Harold Schwark, Captain Philip Seagram, David Dietz, Daniel Shantz, Flying Officer Fred Shantz, Private Joseph Scherer, Major Everett Sims, Lorne Small, Frederick Smith, Captain Lawrence Snellgrove, Private William Snyder, Gunner Burwell Snyder, Squad Leader James Snyder, Clayton Snyder, Paul Snyder, Sergeant Donald Soule, David Souls, Sergeant Harold Spatzel, Flying Officer John L. Spatzel, Private Robert Stahl, Captain Vincent Stark, Private Lorne Stemler, Captain J.N. Stevenson, Private Harold Stevens, Flight Sergeant William Stevens, Private Jack Steffelmeyer, Flight Sergeant Jack Stoll, Private Steve Strachuk, Gunner Harry Stricker, Elward Stricker, Andrew Spick, Lance Corporal George Teasdale, Lance Corporal Robert Thomas, Flight Sergeant William Thurlow, Fred Tucker, Private Charles Tutt, Lance Corporal Stanley Tichert, Signaler Ralph Underwood, Lieutenant George Uttman, Private William Warholz, Private Cameron Washburn, Harry Weber, Russell Whaler, Robert Weinstein, Bert Weir, Richard Wellen, Normal Wedloffer, John Whalen, Sergeant Pilot Donald Whitaker, Warrant Officer Gordon Wildflower, Flying Officer Edward Wilhelm, Major Eric Willis, Flight Lieutenant Harold A. Willis, Private Laverne Wismer, Petty Officer Thomas Withington, Private Lloyd Henry, Lance Corporal Russell Wobsnow, Private Russ Wood, Private Alfred Yance, Lieutenant Bruce Zimmer, Franklin Zaloff. At the very outset of our time together, we pause to recognize the enduring presence of the indigenous peoples connected to and on this land. We are grateful for the opportunity to gather on this traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, land known to them for many generations, and which we acknowledge is situated on the Haldimand Tract, land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. As we are aware of the sacred nature of this territory over thousands of years, so too we gather in this small space in the center of this community on land made sacred by the memory of those who have made more recent sacrifices. On the 11th day of the 11th month, at the 11th hour, in the year 1918, the guns fell silent as an armistice was declared, marking the end of hostilities of the conflict known as the War to End All Wars. In the years that followed, communities across Canada and throughout the Commonwealth of Nations constructed memorials dedicated to our glorious dead. In May 1929, this cenotaph was dedicated by Ontario's Lieutenant Governor. As the years passed, those who left their homes, families, and this community to serve on the front lines of battle in World War II, the Korean War, and Canadian peacekeeping missions throughout our global village have been remembered. Their ultimate sacrifice in the air, on the seas, and on the field of battle has provided us with the liberty to stand here and offer this act of remembrance. The renewal of this space in recent days affirms our civic commitment to honor those whose service led to sacrifice. No words will suffice to add to the dedication which has already been made by the selfless service which we remember. In the moments prior to the 11th hour, we prepare ourselves to offer the Canadian national anthem.
Hello, Birdie. Hot, fair, shot. Harry, code.
they shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, no the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
Today we use words which have a ring of familiarity to them. We will remember them generates an echo response. We are reminded of the words which have been passed through the generations, the poetic words of Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. Those words provide an exhortation that has become even more important in these days. We find ourselves no longer able to be in a position where the simple act of wearing a poppy is something that we can hide behind, saying that we have done our bit and made our contribution to a community expression of remembrance. The reality of this present moment is that we no longer find ourselves being able to live in safety far behind the forward lines of conflict. Today, each and every one of us is called to serve, and that place of service is to be found on the other side of our front door. In this year of 2020, we do not simply need to pause for a moment and remember the sacrifice and service which has been made for us in the past. We see examples of sacrifice and service all around us on the front lines of today's battles. In this moment, we need to take the time to reflect on what the example of service and sacrifice has to teach us as we face visible and invisible foes here at home. No matter what branch of the Canadian Armed Forces are represented, each member of the military knows that their work is an individual contribution given in an effort to achieve a greater goal and cause. They have a sense of mutual responsibility and interdependence, which means that they entrust their lives and their personal well-being into the hands of others with whom they serve. Together, they have an identity and a common purpose. We are not venturing out into a field of conflict equipped with weapons of war, yet our quarrel with the foe is just as real. Our weapons are face masks. We are armed with the self-discipline of social distancing and hand washing. Our foe is not clearly visible, but our need to be mutually responsible and interdependent citizens of Canada, Ontario, and every part of the region of Waterloo is a requirement we cannot shy away from. An invisible enemy is not the only foe we face together. 6 short years ago, Warrant Officer Patrice Vincent was killed in a terrorist attack on Canadian soil. 6 short years ago, Corporal Nathan Cirillo was gunned down while standing guard on ceremonial sentry duty at the Canadian National War Memorial. Just last month, the tomb of the unknown soldier in Ottawa was the focus of hate-motivated graffiti. The front line of battle for our community's health and well-being is here at home. The front line of battle against acts of terror is here at home. The front line of battle for justice and against racism is on the other side of your front door. As we have the expectation that our armed forces are prepared for military service in different parts of our global village, we have also looked to the Canadian military to serve on the front lines here at home as an available resource in the care of our elderly. Canadian citizens we identify as first responders are on the front lines of service in our country today. Those who march for justice are on the front lines in our community today. Canadians who are committed to the cause of peace and reconciliation with the First Nations of this land are on the front lines of today. As Canadian citizens in 2020, we need to renew our personal commitment to catch the torch which has been thrown in our direction. We cannot be spectators, watching and waiting to see who will catch and carry the torch forward on our behalf. At this moment, we pause not only to remember, we pause not only to reflect on the lessons of experience offered by those whose valuable service has much to teach us, but we also pause to prepare ourselves to leave this place, ready to face the challenges of today, holding high the torch which has been given into our care and which lights our way as we face the unknown future together. Presentation of the flags, which will be at the Cenotaph throughout the coming year, is offered by Sergeant at Arms at Gordon. Loving God, we give you thanks for all the blessings of this life and for the very gift and blessing of life itself. We give you thanks that these flags will serve to remind all who pass by the Cenotaph of our commitment to be mutually responsible and interdependent citizens of this community, this province, and this country. We dedicate these flags in memory of those who have gone before us and to the glory of your holy name. Amen.
fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. In Flanders fields the poppies blow. In Flanders fields the poppies blow. We are the dead, short days ago. We lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high. If we break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. The poppies blow in Flanders fields. The poppies blow.
Stand up, please.
In addition to the wreaths which have already been laid and which were mentioned earlier in our gathering, we come now to the presentation of the wreaths. On behalf of the Silver Cross Mothers, a wreath laid by Rose Armstrong. On behalf of the Government of Canada, a wreath laid by Raj Sani, Member of Parliament for Kitchener Centre. On behalf of the Province of Ontario, a wreath laid by Laura May Lindo, MPP for Kitchener Center. On behalf of the Regional Municipality of Waterloo, wreath laid by Regional Chair Karen Redmond. On behalf of the City of Kitchener, wreath laid by Lincoln Bauman, President. On behalf of Her Majesty's Canadian ship Star, wreath laid by Lieutenant Neil Menzies. On behalf of the Royal Canadian Legion Branch 50, Fred Geese Branch 50, wreath laid by Pam Barringer, President. On behalf of the Royal Canadian Legion, Polish Legion Branch 412, a wreath laid by Stan Howie, President. On behalf of the KW Naval Association, the wreath laid by Kelly Hoffman. On behalf of the Waterloo Regional Police Service, wreath laid by Chief of Police Brian Larkin. On behalf of the Kitchener Fire Department, the wreath laid by Deputy Chief Bob Gilmore. Under God's gracious mercy and protection, we commit you. The Lord bless you and keep you. That the Lord make God's face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon you and give you his peace. Be safe. Stay well. Amen. This concludes our gathering today. Thank you all for coming out and being part of today's ceremony. I invite you to remain standing as the color party departs.
Color party, move to the right. Right. Hard. Right, left. What? March. How are you?